Maybe half, almost half the people in here already have one. How many have had it for more than 2 years? A couple of you. So most of you either don't have one, or you're in your first year or first 2 years of owning and operating it. Those of you that have been operating for a year or two, as we go through this, you may have ideas, things that you've seen or come up with as you started to learn to operate your own greenhouse that will be helpful to beginners. Feel free to chime in, not only with questions, but also with tips for things that you've learned already, because operating and managing a greenhouse is a learning experience, and it has a fairly steep learning curve that can be frustrating to beginners. So anytime you hear something you say, well, I wish I'd have known this, just chime in and tell us about that. So we're going to talk a little bit about what greenhouses are, what they're for, kind of how to construct them, what types of greenhouses are out there, and then some on the management aspects of it. And then when we get to the end, if you've got specific questions that I don't address, whether it's on growing certain things in the greenhouse or managing that I didn't cover very well, we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end as well. So in addition to just chiming in along the way. So small greenhouse construction and management is the title that I gave the talk. And you need to know that you'll hear a lot of different terms. There are some nuances and some differences, but generally speaking, they're pretty much synonymous with one another. So you may have heard the term hothouse. It always frustrated me when I was younger and was in the produce business, and people would get a tomato that they didn't like, and they'd say, oh, that's one of them old hothouse tomatoes. You ever heard that phrase? Well, that's not what it was. As a matter of fact, most of those tomatoes they thought were hothouse tomatoes were actually field-grown tomatoes from Florida or Mexico that are picked hard green, ripened, maybe refrigerated, they turn mushy, they just have no texture, no taste. If you ever had a really good hothouse or greenhouse or hydroponic tomato, you knew the difference, because generally speaking, they're very good, especially if the temperature is managed well, and all that affects the taste of vegetables is how well the temperature is managed within the house, disease pressure, all those things we'll talk about as we go along. But that was just a pet peeve of mine. I try to explain to people it has nothing to do with hothouse, because occasionally we would have greenhouse tomatoes available. Oh, I don't want one of those hothouse tomatoes. Taste a good greenhouse grown tomato, especially in the winter when there's not vine ripened field grown tomatoes available. They taste pretty good, and I always liked them when we got those in. Glass houses, because they used to be made primarily out of glass. Anybody remember the old greenhouses that were right here on 278 coming into town? There was a whole bunch of greenhouses there at one time, and they were glass houses, glass greenhouses. And I was in high school. We had a glass greenhouse at the vocational school. Cold frames kind of operate on the same principle as a greenhouse, but of course they're usually small and just low to the ground, and they're just designed to maybe get an early start on some vegetables and give them a little bit of protection, that sort of thing. Some people call it protected agriculture when they're thinking in terms of either growing in a cold frame or a high tunnel or a greenhouse or a hothouse. There's some protection there from the weather. So that idea of protected agriculture. High tunnels is the term we use a lot in now with our fruit and vegetable growers, particularly some of the vegetable growers that want to get an early start on the season. They don't want a full-fledged greenhouse with heating and fans and all that, but they want some protection. So basically they build a greenhouse without all those amenities and use it to just extend the season. In other words, they might be able to start their tomatoes 6 weeks earlier inside the high tunnel, hope they don't get any severe freezing weather, and it gives them some protection. Or in the fall, maybe they want to grow lettuce on out into December, whereas lettuce would get killed by the first freeze. They might have them for a lot longer if they were inside of what's called a high tunnel. It's basically a greenhouse without heating, without fans, and usually doesn't have electricity. And a lot of times the crops are grown directly in the soil rather than in containers like we would in a lot of greenhouse situations. And then hoop house is another name for maybe a smaller high tunnel, where maybe they'll just put a 5-foot hoop. Many years ago, I went to Uruguay, and they had just acres and acres of these low hoop houses. They were only about 3 feet tall, and they just used them to give some protection and an early start for vegetables in the spring. So that kind of goes to what is the purpose for your greenhouse, and everybody's got their own reasons that they might want one. And sometimes there's multiple reasons. If you're kind of a hobby greenhouse operator, which I assume most of you would be, you're not just doing one thing. And I say that just to let you know that if you're doing one thing in a greenhouse, it's much easier to manage. But if you're doing lots of different things, then you've got to kind of find happy mediums, if you will, for what you're doing so that you're able to accomplish several different goals in the greenhouse. For instance, some people use greenhouses for just overwintering their plethora of houseplants. In other words, they want a small greenhouse and they've got lots and lots of houseplants that they don't want to lose, and they want them to stay in a good, healthy condition. So they'll have a small greenhouse. It's just kind of an overwintering house. They may have it designed for propagation. Maybe you want to start your own flower seed or your own vegetable seed, or you want to root your own cuttings of various things. And propagation, for instance, may be a primary goal. And so that would be another reason you might build a small greenhouse. And of course, no matter which purpose for you, it's all about making the environment suitable for what you want to accomplish, whatever it is you want to do. And there are different greenhouses that might work better for certain situations, but like I said, a lot of times you're doing multiple things. So you just kind of have to find something that's a happy medium. But it's all about crop protection, protecting whatever it is you're trying to produce. And there's lots and lots of different designs for greenhouses, and we won't really get into all of them, but just know that they can all work. They can all do what you want to do. So if you've got a particular design that you like aesthetically, maybe to be near your home, then go for that. Now there's certainly differences in terms of economics and what's maybe more efficient, that sort of thing. But if you like something like this crazy looking dome, that can work. If you like something that's kind of a Gothic arch for the architectural aspect of it, it's fine. Or just do a little plain Quonset type. I'd say the three main ones that I see are the Quonset type on the left, and the gable roof type here on the right, upper right, and this is called a Gothic arch type here. It's actually a greenhouse company in Mobile, historic in Mobile County, and it's called Gothic Arch Greenhouses, and they sell kind of small hobby style greenhouses, and I think they've started selling bigger ones now, but that was how they kind of got their business going, was kind of small, very aesthetically pleasing hobby type Gothic arch greenhouses. Now, one reason people might choose that is, and why he probably manufactured them, is they'll work just about anywhere in the country. If you get a big snow load and it's got a steep sides like that, then it's going to shed that off. So they could use it up north without a problem. Whereas down here, we're probably not going to need that often, but might ease your mind when we have a big snowstorm or something like that. So there are different parts of the greenhouse. The gable area that we're looking at here, the end walls, and we'll talk about maybe that could be facing run north to south, and one of the end walls could be very well insulated to protect against the north wind, so you can treat one end different from the other based on its orientation. And then, even though this is kind of a Quonset hut shape to it, you'll notice the earlier one that I showed here, the Quonset shape or the curved shape goes all the way to the ground. Well, the problem with that is you can't grow things on a table or taller things near the side if it starts immediately sloping. But if it has a straight sidewall several feet, there's a lot of advantages to that that I'll mention. One in particular is you can grow even on tables all the way up to the edges, so you don't waste any space in the greenhouse. But probably at least as important, if not more important, is you could put curtains that raise and lower on the sidewalls for ventilation, so that you're not just totally reliant on fans. So it's a passive ventilation system that's real efficient, getting in plenty of carbon dioxide for the plants, allowing cooling, quick cooling of the greenhouse is starting to get too hot. So there's a lot of advantages to having a higher sidewall. The higher the better. And you'll see a lot of commercial ones where they're often 8 feet or more in height. And that's, depending on what you're going to grow, height can be important. If you're going to grow trellis tomatoes, for instance, you'd like one that's fairly tall so you've got some room to work above. And then we might think about what size greenhouse do you actually need. And I've seen hobby greenhouses that were really even smaller than this 4x8 one here, or so. And maybe that's 6x8, but anyway, something along that size. But I've seen them even smaller. I've seen some that are maybe 4x4s, really, really small little greenhouses. Some of these the big box stores will sell little small greenhouse kits. I'll just say this, the smaller they are, the harder they are to manage, which might sound counterintuitive, but you get really quick heating up, but you get ultra quick cooling down, because there's nothing there to hold very much heat, and there's nothing to disperse the heat and you're accumulating heat. So it's really hard. And the closer your plants are to the sides, the colder it's going to be. And if you're almost all sides because you're so small, then it's really hard to manage the temperature in those really small houses. A typical size for kind of a small commercial size greenhouse would be in that either 24 to 30 by 96. And the only reason I mention that is if you're building a larger one like this, 96 is kind of the standard. Does anybody want to guess why that might be? Why not just go to 100?
Multiples of 8 foot.
Multiples of 8 foot? Well, that's a good guess, but that's not why. Any other thoughts?
What size of plastic comes in?
Plastic comes in a 100-foot roll, and if you do 100 feet, you can't make it over the edges and strap it down. So there's a real practical reason why they make them 96 foot. And even you'll see smaller ones, people will make them like 48 instead of 50. That way they get 2 layers of plastic off of 100-foot roll. So it's really more about how long the roll of plastic is, because most of these greenhouses are covered in polyethylene type greenhouse plastic. And make sure if you do use the polyethylene greenhouse plastic, that's what you get is greenhouse plastic, and not plastic off the shelf at Lowe's or Home Depot. They're not going to hold up. They allow different wavelengths of light through than a greenhouse grade plastic, and they're just not made for this purpose. So make sure that you get greenhouse grade plastic. And it comes in different thicknesses. Usually it's 4 mil, 6 mil, possibly even 8 mil, but most people go with maybe a 6 mil, and that's in millimeters, real small thickness in the plastic.
Where did you get one
You can, yeah, you can get it from, a lot of online places, yeah, just, you can Google it, find greenhouse plastic real easy. You're probably not gonna find it at a local store. Just nobody's gonna handle greenhouse, I don't think, that who's gonna handle the greenhouse type plastic. So we're thinking about what do we wanna do in the greenhouse, and we talked about that just a little bit. And it doesn't have to be really firm. If this is a kind of a hobby, you may not know what all you're interested in doing. And it may change. So you may have an idea of, I want to do this. And over my years as an extension agent, I would get people to call that said, hey, I built a 48-foot greenhouse or 50-foot greenhouse, and for my wife to put her plants in during the winter, but we're thinking about maybe how can we make a little extra money with this? What can we do? So they're kind of thinking, how can I use it in other parts of the year? There's certainly things that they could do. So that may change over time. Could be things like I said, starting your own vegetable seed or flower seed, rooting plants. Maybe it's just overwintering plants, or maybe you're doing all of these. Maybe you want to experiment with some hydroponic production. Or aquaponics. Anybody familiar with aquaponics? Anybody ever tried aquaponics? Yeah. It's really difficult. It's like managing a greenhouse is a level 4 in difficulty. Managing an aquaponics hydroponic combination is a level 12 on a scale of 10. So it's much more difficult. But for really ambitious people, if you want to do it as kind of a hobby, it's doable. Don't think you're going to save money on produce or on fish. Probably going to cost you more to produce it than you could buy it for. But maybe that's not the goal. Maybe the goal is you want to produce it just so you can have your own homegrown, not only vegetables, but your own homegrown fish. I personally want to do this myself, but I know how difficult it is because I've worked with people over the years that have done it. The hydroponics not that difficult, and it's something that's certainly within the range of just a hobbyist to learn how to do basic hydroponics. And the only difference between hydroponics and growing plants in a container with the soil or some sort of a soil mix or soilless mix, it is that you're just adding all of the nutrients that the plants need through some sort of a system that either circulates the fertilizer, the nutrients, or it stays with part of the root system in the nutrients, and part of the roots are outside of it. In other words, they use kind of flotation devices to float lettuce plants and herbs and things like that on top of, and that's a very simple system to build. It's basically, as long as you can make it level, and it's at least 8 inches deep, you can add the nutrients that the lettuce and herbs and other things would need, and use basic styrofoam and make holes for the plants to go down in, and then the plants take up the nutrients they need, and you've got a little air gap that provides, some of the roots will be above the water and be able to get oxygen, or they can use a circulating system that pumps air into the water so there's air in the water, and it just stays floating right on top with no airspace between the bottom of the plant and the root system. So anyway, that's another program. We've actually done it here a couple times on hydroponic production. That's one thing you might consider. And you can use a little piece of the greenhouse to experiment with things like this. So the goal is we want to provide an optimum growing condition for our plants. And maybe that's overly ambitious if you're growing a lot of different things. It may be that you're not trying to provide optimum conditions for all the plants, but you're trying to find survivable conditions for most of the plants. You see what I'm saying? You may not be able to get it optimum if you got a lot of different things going in there. Some of them are very tropical, they can't get below 45 degrees, but you got other things that could get down to 35 degrees, and you've got other areas where you're trying to start seed that you need 70 degrees to start the seed. So you're trying to keep things alive, but not necessarily at their optimum growing condition. And it's all about light and temperature control. And in that goes also moisture control, and humidity control, and those sort of things that can affect diseases and whether or not plants will survive long term inside the greenhouse. So when we're building the structure, we're thinking about light. I don't know how many times I've gone out to look at somebody's greenhouse where they put it right up against a line of shrubs or trees or something that blocked out the sun for a big part of the day. So it's like this was really a big mistake. It needed to be located so that it doesn't get those kind of problems, especially during the winter months. It may not be quite as critical during the summer months where you're trying to keep it cooler inside the greenhouse. So some of the things we're considering in the structure itself is whether or not it can take the wind and rain and storms, and particularly ice and snow. I've spent nights in greenhouses in years past when it was coming a big snow with a long broom handle, just punching up and knocking the snow off the greenhouses, because if you get a heavy snow and your heating system is not enough to really keep the air warm enough to melt that snow rapidly, if it's snowing hard and it's snowing, going to be 4 or 5 inches, 6 inches of snow or more, that can be a real problem. This little news clipping here that's referenced was back in 2011 in January, where a greenhouse operator over in Gadsden lost a bunch of houses because there was an 8-inch or so snowstorm that came along. So those can be concerning as well. Wind can be brutal on greenhouses. I've seen many greenhouse plastic coverings lost during severe windstorms. It's very important that they're sealed down very well so that they don't catch wind. Wind get in and catch it. That's how they go off usually. If it's sealed really well, wind will usually just roll over, particularly a Quonset hut type. But if there's a lot of wind coming into it, the other thing is if it's weather is not cold and you can let the sides all the way down, it has tall sidewalls. If your plants can tolerate the wind, then you could do that and let the wind just move straight through, or to put plants on the ground, and if the curtain's lower, leave them just a little bit up so they block the wind some, but they let most of the wind just move on through. But if it's going in one side, it better be able to go out the other side. If it don't, it's going to take the plastic along with it. So what are the materials you might use? Remember, it's going to be wet in there a lot. It's going to be high humidity. Wood will rot very quickly, so it needs to be very rot-resistant type wood if you use very much wood in construction. Redwood, cypress, cedar, things like this. You can use treated lumber, but some people don't want to use treated lumber, or they're afraid of using treated lumber because of the chemicals that are used, that sort of thing. But that's a decision you'll need to make. You can do it, but some people just don't want to do it. It could be built out of steel or aluminum, or something along that line. I've even seen them built out of like the piping from chain link fencing as the bows. So it could be kind of a homemade job using piping like that. I've also seen kind of temporary houses built out of PVC pipe. Those will usually not last very long because PVC pipe is not designed for sunlight. And it starts to break it down and it will crack and break. I can tell you this from bad experience, because the first greenhouse I ever built was when I was about 16 years old, and I built it out of PVC pipe, and it just did not hold up. It's just not strong enough. But for a temporary structure, if it's supported in the middle with wood, something like that, it could be used to have an overwintering greenhouse that might last 3 or 4 years, and then the pipe would have to be replaced. But if you use metal piping, that would be a problem. So the coverings that you might use, we think about in terms of how much light does it let through, how strong is it, how long does it last, what kind of insulating qualities, and generally speaking, anything you cover it with is not going to have very much insulating ability to it. The heat loss can be quite considerable, and this how expensive is it. That's going to determine what you use. Some of the common materials that are available, from kind of the most to least expensive here, would be glass houses. They're going to be very expensive, and there are lots of problems. We'll talk about polycarbonate materials, more popular now. Fiberglass, been around a long time. It breaks down after a few years, but it lasts several years, 15 years maybe. Polyethylene plastic, most of those are rated for about 4 years. And that's the greenhouse grade type plastic. As I said, the glass houses, it's rigid, it's expensive, doesn't hold heat very well. It has the best light penetration though, so that's really critical for you. Excellent light penetration. Straight sides only, of course, because you have to have straight angles everywhere. And don't do it next to a playground with kids in it. Or your own place if you got kids running around start picking up rocks and throwing them, because it causes a lot of damage.
How much would a small one class run approximately?
I'm not prepared to answer that. Yes, how much would it cost, a small glass? I mean, the construction is so ridiculously more expensive in the last 3 or 4 years that I wouldn't even venture a guess. It'd be quite expensive. Greenhouse covering, single wall polycarbonate, it's rigid, it's fairly expensive, not as expensive as glass, but fairly. It's a little better in heat retention, pretty good light penetration. It's not made for making sharp curves. You can make little bends, but that's about it. Good for the end walls, particularly, or maybe the gabled roof and side walls area, and just not the very top part. It's a possibility. And they also make it in double wall, which is much more efficient as far as the insulation, because it's basically a little air gap in between that provides you some insulating capacity. But probably the most used that I see in startups, commercial operations, and hobby houses is using the greenhouse poly sheets, the polyethylene plastic. It's the cheapest, lasts about 4 years, unless you get a bad, windstorm or something that tears it up. You can put 2 layers of plastic and puff air in between it and get quite a bit of insulating capacity. I'll show it on the next slide. And it's very well made for curved structures, of course. You could use it on the sides, or you could use a separate piece on the side that you could use like a curtain, or you can even use kind of an opaque chicken house curtain material. And it lets sunlight in, but it blocks a lot more light than the plastic. But since it's on the sides and not on the top, probably not going to cause a big problem to use an opaque greenhouse, chicken house type curtain material. The reason I mention that is it's available locally at these chicken house supply stores, and it comes in various widths. You can tell them I want an 8-foot curtain or a 3-foot curtain, and they'll be able to get you what you want. And I've used those a lot over the years. They work quite well. As I mentioned, this using 2 layers and basically puffing air in between it with a small fan like the one pictured there. This you can see it. Right there is a little small fan with a hose, and it's a little squirrel cage fan. little hose runs, and you cut a hole and you put it in between the 2 layers of plastic. It doesn't take a very big fan, it just puffs it up and makes a little air gap. So you want to pull your plastic relatively snug, the 2 layers, and then it will puff it up about 3 inches. If you put too much slack in it between the first layer and the second layer, you don't pull it pretty snug, you'll end up with a foot of air, and then you've lost the insulating capacity, and you get a lot of refraction of the light between the first layer and the second layer, just problems. So you only want about 2 to 4 inches max of distance between the 2 layers when it's puffed up. In addition to heat retention, it really reduces the amount of heat loss through the roof by 20 to 30%. It helps a lot with moisture in the greenhouse because you'll get condensation, particularly on 1 layer of plastic. If you've ever had a greenhouse, you probably realize this is kind of maybe a sunny day in the wintertime, and then it cools off real rapidly at night, and you'll get condensation will build up on the plastic and start to drip, and it's not going to drip evenly. It's going to drip some places a lot, some places not much, and so you get some plants that start to die on you, and you wonder what's going on. And it's where the condensation tends to be dripping on those, maybe more than other plants, could be a real big problem. And you got 2 layers between there, and it's blowing warm air from the greenhouse into that area. It stops a lot of the condensation because the plastic is warmed up a little bit. It doesn't have it. You get condensation when you've got warm out here and colder plastic, and then water condenses on it.
Tony, are you going to email these slides to us after the presentation?
I can, if you'll give the email there, I'll send it to them, and they can send it out to whoever wants it.
Okay,
No problem, that'll do it. Okay, so talking about the foundation, you want it to be anchored down to the ground for sure, fairly level to the foundation. Maybe if you're not putting it on concrete or some permanent thing like that, asphalt or something like that, maybe it's gravel or something, you want a little bit of slope no matter what, but 1 to 2% slope is enough. You want to be able to get water out. And I visited some greenhouses a few years ago in southern part of the state or near Tuscaloosa, and they had made all these greenhouses gutter connected, one after the other, but they didn't grade the property well, and water ran off at one end when they had it designed and immediately ran back into the greenhouse. So they had the biggest mess you've ever seen because they didn't put it slightly above grade and have it sloping from one end to the other. So they make sure the water goes away from the house. You certainly don't want water coming back in to the house, even if it soaks into the ground, because the ground's really wet underneath there, and you'll get evaporation as it gets hotter, and it just stays steamy, really high humidity all the time, and that's bad for plants. The flooring, what you're going to put as the flooring, it could be, like I said, gravel, it could be concrete, asphalt, you could use a ground cloth, but not just this simple landscape fabric. You'd want to use what's called a nursery fabric. It's a lot thicker, and it can be used under your tables and places like that to prevent weed growth and slow down evaporation a little bit. And it's relatively inexpensive. It comes in widths of 4 up to about 12 feet wide. Your walkways may be gravel, but if you could do concrete, that's even better. And they even have porous concrete, which allows some of the moisture to go through the concrete. And that's best of all, but it's more expensive. So where we're going to put this thing, you're either going to attach it to something And you see these sometimes advertised on TV and other places where people attach a patio in them or something like that with the greenhouse basically structure, and use that. Those are really nice because they could be designed where you're just moving all your house plants into there for the winter and you enjoy it and sit out there and drink coffee and whatever you want to do, you've got the enjoyment of it as part of your living space actually. So those type of attached may work, and they're also able to use the heating and cooling of the house if it's designed properly. That can help. May be able to help heat your house during the winter months because it could get really warm, and you can open up a door or window and let some of that warmth come into your house and warm things up. So it could be an advantage to do that. Like I said, if you do that, you want to make sure you locate it so it does collect the sun. So it needs to be facing south or southeast, preferably on the side of a structure. Could be southwest, but I'd say southeast or directly south is probably the best. Putting it on the north side is not going to help you a whole lot. You could overwinter plants in there because you keep it warm, and plants don't need that much light in the winter for house plants. So you might could use it for that purpose, but it'd be limited to that. You wouldn't be able to use it for a lot of other things. Maybe propagation would be okay if you got sunlight in there. And then freestanding is probably the more likely scenario where it's a greenhouse that's built separate from your house or from another structure. And by the way, you could do an attached house if you have a garage or a barn or something like that. The first one that I built after my big failure with the PVC one was a lean-to on a barn that we had. Made out of fiberglass and just slanted on with the roof of the barn line because it had a high roof. I just continued on off, and we used that for years and years as a propagation area. I had hot water heated cable or pipes that run through a bed and kept it warm so I could start my seed in there, and it worked really, really good. And then our work area was inside the barn, so it was just a good arrangement. So that's a possibility as well. If you're doing the freestanding, most people think you should run it north and south and insulate the north wall against wind and cold. So that's probably the best orientation. However, if you're in a situation where that's not possible, that doesn't mean you can't do it. You can do it with other orientations as long as it's open around it for several feet, probably 40, 50 feet, so that you don't get a lot of shading from trees and that sort of thing. You can get by with different orientations. So we want to think about, though, does it get at least 6 hours of sunlight a day? Preferably, for most situations, that's what you would want. So you think about it in terms of what's nearby that can provide shading, trees, other buildings. You can get shadows from trees that are pretty good distance away. That can be a problem. I wouldn't want it where I got a lot of shading in the morning, for instance, because you want that greenhouse to be able to heat up fairly quickly, get rid of a lot of that moisture fairly quickly. But if it's shaded for a long time, it takes it so long to get warmed up and so long to get that moisture out of there. That's a real problem. Now, if it gave you evening shade, that's less critical, particularly if you're trying to use this greenhouse year round and you're doing some summer things or late spring, early fall things. You might want a little bit of shade from the hot western sun. So it just depends on what you're doing. But most commercial greenhouse operations, they don't want shade. It's kind of an enemy. They don't want shade because it does cut down on production. And then think about the direction of the force of the prevailing wind. And if you're sitting up on a hill, a lake on or battleground mountain or something, and you get really fierce westerly winds coming across, you may say, well, I'd rather sacrifice a little bit with orientation to turn it so that my gable end is facing the wind and can block off some of that wind rather than the full length of it catching the brunt of the wind. Another thing you can do for the wind situation is you can use a hedgerow of plants far enough away so it doesn't cast too much of a shadow, but it slows the wind down. So that's a really important consideration for particularly plastic houses. If you can just slow the wind down. And it doesn't mean you have to have a thick row of hedges where it's no wind gets through. That's undesirable. You want some of the wind to get through because that helps with your ventilation. But you may want to slow the wind down and prevent those really hard winds from just taking the plastic off. Even a fence could do that, but use something like a slat type fence that lets some wind move on through. Drainage is real important, as I talked about earlier. We want that little bit of a slope from one end to the other. We'd like for this to be perched up above grade slightly, only a few inches, but enough that water runs around and not through the house in the heavy rain and runs from one end to the other. If there is a problem with water accumulating under the house, you can use like these French drain plastic perforated pipe drainage systems to evacuate some of that excess moisture. And that's a good way getting it out if you do run into a problem. Then let's think about things like we're going to need water. I went out with the earlier, looked at the one at the school at Harmony, and they've got lots of things that we talked about that are problems with the greenhouse. They had it donated. Sometimes donations are not that good, and this is probably one of the situations because the house is real low profile, just barely over your head in the middle. Once the head comes down, and it comes down really flat, so that your sidewalls is just a foot away from the sidewall. You're only this far from the plastic. Well, that's really bad situation. They didn't have water out there to it. They had to run like a long hose. They had electricity, but they didn't have a gas line run out there for heat. And so it's just a lot of things they're going to have to do to make that thing work. Think about those ahead of time and try to get that all figured out before you site it, put it in your landscape. You're going to need electricity for lots of things, but particularly for ventilation and possibly running the fans. If it's not electric heat, probably at least has a fan and a gas heater that runs the fan that moves the heat through the house. Maybe you're going to use germination pads. You know what germination pads are? These little heat pads that you can buy. If you don't, you can see one back here in their storage area. They've got one where they start seed. Now those are really good tools because maybe it's February and it's hard to keep that greenhouse warm, and you only need to keep it at about 40 to keep your houseplants from dying, but you're trying to start some tomato seed. And guess what? You're not going to start tomato seed at 40 degrees temperature, but you can put them on a heat pad, a grow pad, and they're run on electricity. I had one, as I mentioned years ago, that ran on hot water, and the hot water just ran through a bed of sand. So it's possible to do it that way, but I still had to have a pump the water in circular fashion through the hot water heater. And your zone where your seedlings are, or your propagation, can be kept at any temperature you want easily. You can keep 72 degrees. That's perfect for tomato germination or rooting a lot of cuttings. And your above ground part is fine if it's only 40 degrees in there.
Where
Because
did you buy those?
that's another one that you probably have to go
I
online.
got mine through Amazon.
And you can go online and get them. They might have them at a place like Chambers. I don't know.
They do have them at Chambers,
Chambers, yeah.
actually.
So that's good. But that one's designed for like one tray.
Yeah.
One of those trays. And those are invaluable to start seed or propagate plants. You don't have to keep the whole greenhouse at 70. You only want to keep the soil at 70. when it's small, so really a good useful tool for you. So you need electricity for several things. Other things about it is, does it blend into your landscape? Does it look good? I'd say this for you men who have wives, it better look good in your landscape. Because if it doesn't, your wife's gonna make you tear it down. So you might as well try to make it something that aesthetically is pleasing. Believe me, that's another one I learned from experience. I decided to do a hydroponic operation on our front porch, and my wife did not like me doing a hydroponic operation on my front porch. She had to walk through this jungle to get to our door. But it was an experiment, and I told her it's temporary, it's an experiment, so I got by with it, but I had to take it down at the end of the year. It hasn't gone back up. Height, I mentioned, is important. Taller structures are easier to control temperature and moisture. You just got more room to work with. Your heat goes up, and if you're like this greenhouse out at Harmony, it's only about 6.5, 7 feet tall. All your heat is right at you. I mean, it's right in your face, and it's just, that's just a bad situation. And then you may be inside of a city or something where you have to follow certain codes and get permits and build a certain material. So you need to investigate that if you're living in an urbanized area that requires that. And then think about how many square feet do I need? And is it designed so that if I decide to do more, can I expand it in some way? And like I said, it may be that you're doing a lot of different things. And what I found is once people get into using greenhouses, they get more plants than they ever imagined. Because they don't feel like there's any reason not to get a plant. It's going to survive. We're going to keep this with a greenhouse. Maybe not true, but anyway, that's what people think. So build it as wide as possible for your purposes, because if you want to extend the length, you can do that fairly easily in most situations, but it's harder to make it wider once it's a certain width. How big do I need to get it? Well, you need to figure out kind of how much you're aiming to grow. Just as an example, and you can find these charts online that tell you how many plants can you get in a certain area. But a 6-inch containerized plant, even though it's only 6 inches, still needs about a square foot so that it can have room from the top to expand beyond the size of the pot. And as I said, the taller structures are just easier to manage temperature and moisture. It's illustrated here by this picture. The air volume, the floor space. Now, the greater the air volume, the more air has to be heated. So I have heard people say, well, the taller I build, the more I've got to heat. And there's some truth to that, but there's some ways you can reduce that problem. You can use a thermal break, a barrier between upper and lower, right at the gable height that you pull. It's almost like a curtain that pulls and holds the heat in below it. And I've seen these systems work quite well, but the disadvantages of having it too short, I've already gone into far outweigh it. So I would want a taller house with at least a 3-foot to 4-foot sidewall. My favorite are when they're 5 foot or even 6, 7, or 8 feet. But a minimum, I would want a 3 or 4 foot sidewall. Tall houses get hot slower naturally. Short houses get hot very fast. Nowhere for the heat to go. So what temperature am I shooting for? Well, that's a really difficult question to answer because I don't know what you're growing and kind of the growing requirements. If you're just trying to overwinter houseplants, generally speaking, if you keep them a few degrees above freezing, they'll survive. Even though it may say the optimum temperature for this plant is 65 to 85 degrees, they can probably take it at 40 or 35 for short periods of time and survive, as long as it doesn't freeze or frost, so you can get by with that. So that's going to affect what kind of heating system you're going to use and that sort of thing. that you may at times not be optimum, but it's gonna survive. You can use temperature to control things like the plant growth. Everybody's probably seen tomato plants that they thought were just kind of tall and spindly. They just didn't have, very good structure to them. Some of that is because the greenhouses run too hot. They never let it cool enough to slow the plant growth down. And had they slowed the plant growth down, then it would have got stockier. They give it a little bit of wind exposure, and the sidewalls being lowered, but not so much that it just kills them with a heavy cold wind, but just gives them a little breeze. The movement of plants make them grow stockier. There's very little air movement, it's very hot. They're gonna grow very rapidly and get tall and very spindly. You can control the timing somewhat of when a crop is ready. I've done this growing transplants. If I wanted to speed it up, I may let it get a little warmer so that they would grow a little bit faster, but that happy medium where they didn't get too spindly. But if I wanted to slow them down because I was backed up with too many plants, I could make it colder and slow the growth down considerably. Whether or not you're growing just vegetation, or am I trying to produce tomatoes or pepper? That can affect how warm you keep it. If you're just growing vegetation and you want the best looking plants, then maybe the temperature is 60, 65 degrees, or maybe you can get by even to 55 degrees. You need to slow it down a little bit. It can still grow. But if you're growing tomatoes and you want to set fruit, and they don't set fruit below temperatures of about 60, then if you let it get too cool, you'll grow a nice tomato plant, but you're not going to have any tomatoes, which is your goal. So if it's a reproductive part, that's why I'm saying vegetative versus reproductive, it has to be warmer in most instances to produce flower and set fruit than if you're just growing vegetation. That makes sense? Uh-oh. Germination, rooting, we've already talked about that. Using those heating pads can make a big difference. You got a big area to use. As I said, you could use a small hot water heater and pump water in a circular fashion through a zigzag formation of hex line or CPVC pipe in a bed of sand. And set your plants there and stay toasty warm. Set it on a thermostat and the unit will kick on and circulate the water whenever it gets below that temperature to keep plants just at the perfect temperature. You can also, I don't have this on the slide, but you can also build little germination chambers where you have a little box that's enclosed and you only have to keep that box at a certain temperature. You don't have to keep the whole greenhouse at a certain temperature. And I've built these before, just made them out of wood with racks in there, put a humidifier, keep the humidity high, and pump some heat source in there, either heat pads or just pump a little heat from another source into that little box and kept it warm and humid to germinate or propagate. And the rest of the greenhouse may be quite cool in February, where you let it stay at 50 degrees at night, 45. But inside that box, it's 75 degrees and 100% humidity. And so the seeds germinate real quick. I've actually seen tomato seeds germinate in 2 to 3 days in a germination chamber like that, because it's just a perfect environment with 100% humidity and 72 degrees root soil temperature. And that works for almost everything. There are a very few things. There's some flowers, and lettuce is the only vegetable I can think of that requires light to germinate. So you do a little research if you're growing something unusual, particularly flowers, or if you're growing a lot of lettuces, that you can't use a germination chamber where it's totally dark. Now you could use it with some grow lights and do it, but you couldn't do it in the dark. Most everything germinates fine in the dark. If you want something to flower, it has to have a certain temperature. And you can easily research most anything. Just say, what temperature does this plant flower at? Whether it's a flower or a vegetable, there'll be an optimum temperature for flower initiation. In other words, that the buds will turn into the type buds that will make flower.
How big would you build your
depends on how many things you're germinating at one time, but I've seen them as small as where one tray is all that it will hold. And the little one that we built, years ago when I was running the greenhouse was, hold about 25 or 30 trays at a time. And then I've seen in big commercial houses where they put 1,000 trays inside of a big germination chamber. So just depends, but you can build them any size you want.
Would you repeat the questions?
How big does this germination chamber have to be?
Yeah, no, I got that one, but I know, one earlier I couldn't hear it.
I don't remember what that one was. I don't remember what the question was.
No, I.
Sorry. But I'll try to repeat it from now on, that'll help. Okay, so heating, night temperature, maybe you're thinking in terms of, I wanna keep it in the 55, 65 degrees. I don't want it to ever get colder than 35, and I wanna keep it below 85. Maybe that's your goal. These things are gonna determine how big your heating unit has to be to accomplish that based on the structure that you build and how much airspace you've got to warm. All of those things can be computed out so that you can figure it out. And it may be, what fuel have I got available? Maybe I don't have natural gas. I'm gonna have to either use propane, or I'm gonna have to use a wood heater, or some other heat source. So those are gonna determine a lot of this as well. How big is that greenhouse? How much does it cost to operate it? I had a greenhouse operator just contact me recently and said, propane's got so expensive, I'm considering switching over and using wood heat, and wanted some advice on using wood heat. I had an uncle years ago, many years ago, that he heated his house and a greenhouse with an outside wood burning furnace that would pump the heat to his house or to, it has cut a lot of firewood, but that was a very inexpensive way to heat if you had access to the wood to do it. So there's all sort of things that you could do. And the covering type will affect that. If you've got 2 layers of plastic, it's a lot less heat needed than if you've only got 1 layer. How much wind does it get? How much insulation do you have on the north wall? That sort of thing. Do you want something that's operated with a thermostat, you don't have to mess with it that much, or are you going to have to do a lot of manual operation of it? How much time it's going to take, all those kind of play into what system that you used. You're going to use a wood heater and you don't get out there and put wood in that, furnace in a cold night, guess what happens the next morning? You just start to clean out all the dead plants. Where do I put my thermostat? You want it about average plant height, and if you've got plants at different heights, it's kind of average. You don't want it to be in direct sun. You want some shade over it somehow. Make some kind of shade over the thermostat so the sun doesn't hit it directly, because that'll give you a false reading. And about midway to the house is always a good rule of thumb. If it's a gas heater, for instance, and any kind of heat, but particularly gas heaters, they have to be vented so that the fumes don't just come back into the house. You got to have really. I visited the house one time where the guy's tomato plants were dying and nothing else, and he had gas heat, and it was just enough leakage to cause death to tomato plants, which are hypersensitive. And his other plants were surviving. But it was hurting the other plants, but it wasn't noticeable. The tomato plants were all twisted up, looked like he'd sprayed them with Roundup or something. And it turned out to be just his venting system was not good enough. He was getting some backdraft, pulling some of that in through his fans, that sort of thing, back into the house. Needs to be well up above the eave and not near where the fans would suck the air back in. So you're going to be tested on this at the end. You need to be able to memorize this chart to pass the test. I just put this in here for illustrative purposes that, yes, there are ways you can just get on the internet and Google it and figure it out. For greenhouses, what size greenhouse heater do I need for my house? and it'll give you some things like this, charts to figure out. But I just use an example here of this one where, you know the temperature that you want to keep the house at. You got the, let's see. Okay. So let's say we want, we don't want it to go below 45 in the house. So looking down there at the bottom, in the outside temperature, we don't want it to get below 10 degrees. You know, so if your winters are below 10 degrees, you need to go down to 0. But let's say for us in Coleman, probably you could figure on about 10 degrees, about as cold as we'll get most of the time. So you want to keep it at 45, and I want to be able to heat if it gets down to as low as 10 degrees. And my house is 20 by 50, or approximately 1,000 square feet. So the number the constant that we'll be using is this 42 here. And we take 42 and multiply it by our square footage, and that gives us 1,000 times 42 equals 42,000. That's the BTU rating the heater would need to be. So BTU, the heaters, these gas heaters will come in probably about the lowest you can get, maybe 50,000, or you might get one a little more than that. But they'll go up to 100,000 or 200,000 or more for bigger greenhouses. So you want to probably design it so it's a little bigger than what you think you'll need, but you don't want to over design. So you have one that'll heat a 30 by 96 foot greenhouse, and yours is only half that size. Because you're just wasting money, and they're not as efficient if they're too big than if they're just the right size. So the type heating that we might use, if it's a really, really small little 4x4 greenhouse, you might just have a little electric heater that just keeps it warm enough so things don't freeze on you. But if you're getting any size at all, maybe above 200 square feet or more, you're probably going to have to use some sort of a gas forced air type heat. As I said, you could heat wood if you wanted to. You can use anything you want, but that's generally the size where we start thinking about we need some kind of forced air where the fan blows heat in through the greenhouses. And the way the greenhouse, the heat is circulated is either by fans hanging from the ceiling that circulate the heat from one end to the other and back, where you're hanging a fan here and you're hanging another one at the other end on the other side, and it's kind of making a rotation of the air. Or you can buy plastic tubes that hook onto the fan exhaust for the heater, and they connect to it with a strap of some sort, and they've got perforated holes in it, and it runs down the eave of the house above your head, and it allows the air to come out, the forced air to come out of that tube in the little holes. And those are really efficient, good ways of distributing one end of the house to the other. If it's just blowing, if it's a long house, it may not distribute it very well. If it's a really short house, it's probably not going to be an issue. Just the fan on the heater itself might be enough. But if it's very long, you may want to consider some other way of getting the air movement one end of the house to the other. So gas-powered forced air heat is probably one of the best options for these medium to larger size. They can run on either propane or natural gas. Maybe you're just trying to keep things from freezing, and you just want a heating system that keeps it above freezing, 35 degrees or something like that, so you might get by with a smaller heater. But if you're trying to grow commercially or trying to grow them in a little better environment, then you're probably going to have to design it so it at least keeps things up above 45 or 50 degrees. Already talked about those heating pads, and she brought one in here where you see those are great for starting seeds or propagating cuttings. There's alternatives that you could use, as I said, wood heat, geothermal systems, anything that you would use to heat your house, you could also use for a greenhouse. The only difference is going to be, how much cost am I willing to spend for this, and how much convenience versus money. If wood heat is just not convenient, it's hard to get the wood, or it's too much work, then maybe that's not an option. And geothermal's pretty expensive, but it's very efficient. So we need to anticipate the heat movement. If you're running it year round, it can get really, really hot. In the summertime, it's hard to keep things alive sometimes. Think about this, solid objects like benches or concrete, they accumulate heat real quickly. You need to begin your ventilation early. In other words, don't wait till it's 85 degrees in there and then say, well, now I'll open the curtains or I'll turn on the fans. It'll get 100 before you can turn around very quickly. I had a bad experience with that when I was a teenager and built a small greenhouse. Me and a friend decided to go into the greenhouse business together, and we were going to grow tomato plants, and his father ran a hardware store, and we were going to make a fortune selling tomato plants in his hardware store. And his mother was very good about opening our greenhouse up for us, school days in the morning on winter days when it was pretty cool outside, but the sun was shining. But one day it was pretty cold, and she thought, well, I don't need to open it today. It's pretty cold. And guess what? On a sunny day when it's cold outside, it can get 110 or 120 degrees inside that greenhouse in a hurry, particularly a smaller greenhouse like we had. And when I got back that evening, curtain's still not down. It warmed up to about 50 degrees with bright sunshine, and every plant just laying down, completely laying down. And every one of them died very quickly. So hot days, things can happen in a hurry. You either have to have some kind of automated ventilation or be very diligent to make sure that you're watching that. And that's even true, like I said, in the winter months or the cooler months of the year. Especially if you're talking about in the winter months, it cools down really quick too. So that's the other thing. You have a nice bright sunny day, and it's nice and warm in that greenhouse, but it's going to be a cold night. As soon as the sun goes down, that temperature drops like a rock in that greenhouse. So you have to be, watching it. One thing I tell folks to do in those kind of cold night, when you're expecting a cold night, it was a sunny day, is you can let it get a little too hot for a little while. In other words, you could seal it up at, say the sun goes down at about 5 or 5:30, you can seal it on up at about 3:30. A couple hours before the sun's completely down. Go ahead and seal up the sides and maybe reduce the fans or turn the fans off completely and let it build up. And it might go up to 85 degrees. But that's good because it's going to drop really fast, and some of that heat is going to be stored in the rock and the gravel and the plants themselves and in the tables. And it helps to capture some of that before the sun goes down. I see a lot of operators who go out there and they'll just leave it sides down until the sun is completely down. It's already dropped to 50 degrees, and then they go over the curtain up. Well, they've lost a lot of that heat that they could have captured. That would have reduced the amount of time the heat ran in the night. But sealing it up the best you can. I've even seen people take barrels filled with water that are painted black to absorb some of the heat and release it during the night so the sun would allow that water to absorb some heat, act as a heat sink. All those things can reduce the amount of heat you have to use. And these thermal curtains that are pictured here, and it's like a material that you can get from greenhouse supply companies that provides some insulation ability, and they hang over your head at the gable height, and you just kind of pull them like a curtain. They can even be automated, and so you can, at night, you can pull those before the sun even goes down. Go ahead and pull those and act like a curtain to stay warmer where your heat is being distributed below that. Make sure your heat is being distributed below that, and then cooler, in that top part. And then the next morning when the sun comes up, you can open it back up. And those can be really, really efficient ways of controlling temperature. Cooling effect, radiation cooling effect, condensation is bad for plants. I'll just say that. As I already talked about this, moisture condenses not only on plastic but on leaf surfaces because it's going to be cooler on this leaf surface than it is the air around it. So that means the condensation is going to form on the leaf, which is the least desirable place because that's where the disease organisms start to grow. So what do we do about that? Air movement. It's all about ventilation. If you don't have good ventilation, you will have lots of diseases develop. So we want to make sure the air movement in the house is happening all the time. Circulating air is really important. Continuously circulating air is good. It moves the heat and the warm air around the plant so it doesn't condense the water as much, and that really helps a lot. So how do we get this air in there? There's a lot of different ways you ventilate greenhouses. You can have a ridge vent. We'll see in just a second. I'll show you what that looks like. You have side curtains or side vents. You can make it automated so that the roof vents open with a thermostat, and that can help. There's just lots of different ways you can do it. You can have fans that pull air through the house, from one end to the other. When we went out there to Harmony, I noticed they had the fan going, but they didn't have the end wall vent open. And so it was just sucking air from all the cracks and crevices, but not running the length of the house. And most of it was coming from right near the fan, whereas air is just doing this. It's just making a little loop, and it wasn't pulling it from one end of the house to the other. So you got to have a vent that'll open at one end and a fan pulling it at the other end to actually move the air from one end of the house to the other. Sidewalls, you get natural ventilation, and that works also. There's an example of kind of small ridge vents. You can have them that run the whole length of the house, like you see on the bottom, or you could have little small ones. I've even seen these put in little small plastic houses where you can just put it in there, attach it to the plastic around, and grow a thermostat, and it'll open up. So if you got a small plastic house and you don't want to have to be out there every morning, as soon as the sun comes up, you can have something like this, and it'll work for quite a while to get the heat out. And then it may get so hot that you have to do something else. But at least that would keep it from building up too much heat too quickly and be set so that, say it gets 85 degrees, that thing will open up and exhaust that heat. Heat rises, so you're going to quickly lose it to the top. And what I was talking about pulling it from one end to the other, you got to have, vents at one end and fans at the other so that you do get movement all through the house. And as I talked about, you can do it several ways. The ridge vent is a good way. Passive air movement, it's just hot air going to move. It's going to pull cooler air from other areas. An exhaust fan, if you can get one that's got more than one speed, that's a good idea for small houses because if it's got really high speed, it may get it too cool too quick on a winter day. And maybe if you just had a low speed fan, you can control that a little better. You got to have vents on one end if you got the fan on the other. You can use these air poly tubes that I talked about for here and just blow air through it. And that can circulate air good. That's a good way to get air movement. And then, as I said, you could have a fan on one end of the house pushing air this way, and then one over here pushing air that way, and it starts the air in a circular motion, as we see in this illustration here. So other ways to cool, other than ventilation that we just talked about, is you can use shade cloth. That's why people use shade cloth in the warmer months, is to just block out a certain percentage of the sun. And depending on what you're growing, that can work very well. You can use paint. Basically, they use like a latex paint, about 1 part latex paint to 25 parts water. Mix it up and spray it on the sprayer. And it blocks out a good bit of the light, just depending on how much of the material you put on there. And it'll last a season, and you can just wash it off with hot water soap. So just blocking light in addition to ventilation is a good way. Shade cloth can be purchased anywhere. You can get other greenhouse supplies. You can get it in 30 to 50% shade grades, and probably in most situations that's the grade you will stand. You can actually get it up to 80, but that's too much light blockage for most plants. And anything below 30 is probably not going to give you enough. So I like to stay in that 30 to 50% range. Take these off in the winter when you need more sunlight, and just use them during the hotter times of the year. And then just kind of lastly summing up here, these things don't manage themselves. you're gonna have to, no matter how much automation you do, and you get techie and do all kinds of things where you control it with your smartphone, temperature, see what the temperature is, you still gonna have to have a lot of hands-on to make sure these things are operational and it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's good to have those kind of alarms though. They're very handy for commercial growers. They've got alarms on their phone where if the temperature gets above a certain amount, they send them a message to say, hey, something's wrong. So they can be helpful, but you can't totally depend on the technology. You're gonna have to spend some time managing it, kind of learning how things run based on the light, and the wind, and the temperature, and all those sort of things. And then you make those changes accordingly as you learn. As I said, when small hobby greenhouses have many different types of plants, you just got to find a happy medium. In other words, what is best for the majority of things that I'm growing for the majority of the year, and then make little changes to the other. For instance, you could have a shade cloth on part of the house where you have plants that need a lot of shade, and then on the other part of the house you don't. So you could even do that. All right, I know I've probably run out of time here, but do you have any questions that I can answer, or any comments from your experience running a greenhouse that might be helpful to some of these beginners?
What is your optimum moisture content that you want in there?
The humidity
Yep.
level? Yeah, I would want to keep it in the below 70%, so somewhere maybe the 50 to 70% range. Plants need humidity, they just don't need, excessive humidity. I did talk about using the water vapor cooling pads where you put one end of the house, you have water dripping down a pad, and you see these in these chicken houses all over the county. Water drips down that pad, and then the fan on the other end pulls that moisture-laden air through there. Well, the problem here is our humidity is already so high, and you start adding more moisture into the air, you get that humidity too high. And we want to keep the humidity under control so that it's not conducive for disease development. So those don't work. They're kind of an emergency thing. It gets really hot, you need to try to do something. And if the humidity is not too hot, that'll work. When I was a kid, we lived in California. Nobody had air conditioning. They used what they call swamp cooling. And that's basically what it is. Water and then air moving through the water and putting moisture. Now, if your humidity, like it was out there, was 10%, you could have a 100-degree day and pump water through there and get it down to comfortable, 70, real easy with just water. But if your humidity is already 80%, you don't have much room to change the temperature because it's already laden with moisture. And so it doesn't really help that much. But we'd like to keep it in the 50 to 75% range. Hard to do though. You can't keep it that way all the time. It's just so much humidity here. You're not going to keep it lower than it is outside in general. So if it's 90% humidity outside, you're not going to get it much lower than that inside. You can some with fan exhausting some of it, but not a lot. Good question, though. Anybody else got a question? Quick question?
You're doing like fruiting plants. What do you do about pollination?
Pollination for like vegetable
Yeah,
plants?
tomatoes or something like that.
Yeah, well, tomatoes are wind pollinated, so you can just bump the plants, bump the strings a couple times a day when they're blooming, and it'll release the pollen in fall. And so just the air movement alone does a pretty good job. Now, if you're growing something like squash, you're either going to have to hand pollinate, or you're going to have to keep, like you can buy little boxes of bumblebees that are designed for pollination purposes from greenhouse supply companies, and put them inside the house, and they'll work for quite a long time, and you just replace them as you need. So if you're growing a lot of things that require insect pollination, you got to either do it hand pollination, or you've got to have some bees in there to do the pollination for you. But a lot of things can be pollinated just by wind movement that don't require insect pollination, but they don't. And even like cucumbers, which typically do, they have certain varieties that are seedless cucumbers They don't require pollination, they don't produce seed, but you don't care if they produce seed or not, if you eat them. So it's better, I'd rather have them without seed. And I've grown those before, and they're easy to grow, you don't need any extra system for pollination of those at all.
I've got a couple of tomato plants and I've got little blues like this and I've got purple like this. But they got little white, look like lilies.
White leaves,
No.
Or white bugs.
Little fine.
yeah, it could be either you've got a bad population of aphids, you could be getting white flies. If they fly around when you bump the plant, you've got white flies. But also the little dead skin of an aphid can be really white, so sometimes that, and it could be something else. I just have to see what it was. But we didn't talk about pest management, but that's a whole different thing we can spend another program on, because insect management, pest management in a greenhouse can be a challenge.
Will you do that later?
We can do another one. I'll suggest it to Rachel that maybe we'll do a future one on kind of insect pest management or disease management. We've done them in the past, so we'll try to do another one on that. We're going a little closer on time to try to tackle it tonight. Yeah. Yeah. Shrivel up. She's talking about her squash will start to grow and then shrivel up. That's a lack of pollination. If they're not pollinated, the seed don't start to develop, and the seed is what causes the fruit to expand. So if you don't have the seed, in a lot of things, you don't get any, they'll just start to shrivel up on the ends. It's a blossoming rock sort of thing, but it's primarily from lack of pollination in this case. All right, well, thank you guys. I know we're past time, so if you got a question, come up and ask me. Other folks go, and you want to scan that QR code? You got it somewhere?
Yes, sir, that'd be great.